Hello there. After a rather changeable October, things have finally quietened down a little bit as we started November. High pressure being a bit more dominant over the last week or so. It did weaken a little bit during the weekend. We've seen a little bit of showery rain through the weekend and the beginning of this week. But in general, it's nowhere near as wet or indeed as windy as it was at times through October as well. And so we're getting to that time of the year where evaporation rates are quite crucial, and they are on the slide as we head deeper towards the colder season, the winter season. And you can see on this graph here the sort of average evaporation rates you would expect across central and eastern parts of England through the course of the year. So very high evaporation rates going on in the summer months, but they do drop off pretty quickly as you go through the autumn and into the winter. For example, October here, 30 millimetres as a monthly average amount of evaporation from the soils. That almost halves as you go down into November, and that halves again as you go into December. So rapidly dropping rates of evaporation. Of course, at this time of the year, the sun is getting weaker every day. So evaporation from the sun is becoming a less of an impact. And so we basically at this time of the year then rely on the wind to help evaporate things. And well, the winds have been very light over the last few days. And even when you do get some strong winds, it's often accompanied by yet more rain, adding more moisture to the soils. So the ground's still pretty waterlogged in quite a few places, and it's only slowly going to improve as long as things stay mostly dry and also fairly sunny. And it has been quite cloudy and misty and gloomy during the last couple of days at least. So looking at things through the rest of this week, this is for Wednesday now. Many places actually starting on a dry note. There is a next weather front coming in off the Atlantic, courtesy of this area of low pressure, and this is going to deepen and run up towards western Scotland as we go through the day on Wednesday, and it'll push this front eastwards through the course of the day. So not getting to the far east till quite late on in the day. But with that front, we could see some fairly squally conditions for a time through the Irish Sea into western parts of Britain. Some quite blustery winds too, perhaps gusts of 50, maybe 60 miles an hour in some exposed western areas, and then that front generally weakening a bit further east, but still the dregs of that there across eastern England through Wednesday night, very early on Thursday morning. Then for Thursday daytime, what we see is this ridge building in. So we're sort of in between systems for Thursday daytime itself. The early rain clears away, many places having a dry day, and then the next weather system coming in off the Atlantic from this rather deep area and very large area of low pressure covering much of the North Atlantic. But even at this stage, Thursday evening, many places still dry, but the rain getting into western Scotland, parts of Northern Ireland. And again, with that, some strengthening winds as that approaches from the west. And then that weather system also scoots its way eastwards through Thursday night, weakening quite a bit by the time we get to Friday. Now, this front will tend to be a bit slow to clear, we think, across parts of southeastern parts of the UK on Friday. So there's still a bit of a question mark about how quickly this clears and how much rain might be left on it, but it could be a bit damp at times in the southeast on Friday. Brightening up from the west, still though quite blustery and plenty of showers piling into western Scotland, perhaps even merging to give some longer spells of rain at times as low pressure stays close by off towards the north. And then for the weekend, not a great deal of change. It's still pretty changeable, really. We still have low pressure in charge. Generally, though, most of the lows tracking to the northwest of the UK. So the bulk of the wet weather will always be the further northwest you are. But as you can see here, even at times through the weekend, there will be bits and pieces of rain that do eventually manage to make their way down towards the southeast. And with that, fairly breezy conditions too, but it's all coming in off the Atlantic, so it's all fairly mild conditions. There's not a great deal of frost to be had this week, unlike last week, with temperatures near or even a smidge above average at times, and generally not too chilly overnight, unless you're in some of the sheltered glens of Scotland or perhaps parts of northern England, where the winds may ease down with skies clearing during the overnight period. So it's quite changeable this week. There'll be some rain at times, most of it in the west, but there will on occasion be rain getting further east as well. Now for the early part of next week, what we're likely to see is high pressure starts building over the nearby continent, and just subtle shifts in positioning of these highs and lows means we get more of a southerly flow next week rather than the westerly flow that we've got for much of this week. So this is still a pretty mild direction, drawing in air from quite far south up across the UK. Again, low pressure's off towards the northwest, and that will be where most of the rain again will tend to be. So parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, maybe other western parts of Britain will see some rain at times next week. But with that high pressure close to the southeast, it's possible the early part of the week could actually be fairly dry in that southeast corner. There's still a bit of a question mark about how dominant this high is versus these fronts that want to come in from the Atlantic. But there may still be some dry days in there in an otherwise fairly changeable looking pattern. And then what's likely to happen through the middle part of the week is this whole area of low pressure will tend to shift a bit further east across the UK before we see this ridge down in the middle of the North Atlantic starting to build in more towards the end of the week. So this is just a snapshot of what might happen at the end of the week. Again, don't take it literally, but high pressure building more widely across parts of the UK. The question mark is exactly where this high develops. The most likely solution at the moment is the centre of the high stays to the southwest, so probably a bit further south than this suggests, by the end of next week. That's still going to allow these weather fronts to run in across the northern side of that high and topple in. So northern parts of the UK could still well see some further outbreaks of rain through the second half of next week, and breezy conditions too, while the further south you are, perhaps a better chance of some slightly more settled weather developing second half of next week and into next weekend. Still a long way off to iron out the detail, and even in this high you can still get some rather weak fronts with some areas of low cloud and damp drizzly conditions. So I'm not promising it'll be bone dry for the second half of next week, but on balance a lot of dry weather on offer away from perhaps northern parts of the UK where you may still get some of this wet weather coming in off the Atlantic. And just to show that in a slightly more detail and the type of uncertainty we're dealing with here, this is an ensemble forecast for Shropshire. Each of these grey lines is a different computer model, and the red line is the average of all of those grey lines. And you can see for this week there's lots of ups and downs as each low comes in and then a ridge builds in between, and then the next low comes in. So it's fairly changeable during this area here where there is high confidence. And then as the spread gets larger into next week, confidence starts to reduce a little bit. But what we do notice is quite a trend here for pressure to rise as you go further on through next week. And there are some ensembles, and quite a few of them are actually building quite a strong high here in above 1,040 millibars later on next week. Equally, there are one or two members that are going for some pretty deep lows, but these are the minorities. You can see there's very few lines down here. But the impact of these quite deep lows showing up is dragging this average line down somewhat, when in reality the most likely solution is somewhere up here with high pressure building in, at least across southern parts of the UK during the second half of next week. And then only a gradual decline in pressure really beyond that into the following week. So that high pressure could hang around in some shape or form for a while. I think it will tend to wax and wane, so not necessarily there all the time. But at least there is a trend for high pressure to be close by, and maybe there could be a couple of days where the high weakens a bit, we get an area of low pressure coming in and some weakening fronts before the high then rebuilds again, going further ahead. So looking at the dry days, which we look at quite often here on the farming forecast, the greens here, just a reminder, are where you're more likely to have a wet day, and the browns, especially the darker browns, such as down here, where you're more likely to have a dry day for all these places in the UK down the left-hand side, and the date along the top going forward in time. So it's quite unsettled looking here through the rest of this week and into the weekend, especially in the north and the west. But there is a signal down here across southern and eastern parts of the UK, and indeed parts of eastern Scotland just up here too, for things to perhaps have a slightly higher chance of some dry weather during the second half of next week. As I say, still a long way off, and there will be some ironing out of the detail, but in general that is the trend. Drier in the south, or becoming drier overall, but still staying quite wet at times the further north you are. But just bear in mind that high pressure may not stick around and give you completely dry conditions for 2 weeks. There will still be a couple of days in there that do bring some occasional wet weather. And much depends on the position of that high, as I've described. If the high is further south, it will allow fronts in off the Atlantic. If the high builds further north, it'll be drier. And if it builds even further north than that, then you may still get some showers coming in off the North Sea with an easterly wind. So this is the most likely pressure pattern then for next week, 16th to the 22nd of November across Europe. High pressure, or higher than normal pressure, across much of mainland Europe. The position of the high somewhere in Central Europe here, allowing westerly winds across Scandinavia and easterly winds down across the southeast. And that has a big impact on the temperature. Westerly winds allowing very milder than average conditions across Scandinavia. As you can see, some deep red showing up here, but much colder than normal conditions across southeastern Europe because of that easterly wind on the southern flank. And high pressure often brings dry weather. As you can see, brown showing up quite widely across the UK, across many parts of Europe, including southeastern parts of the UK. But notice northwestern parts of the UK here, most likely to see rain at times with above average rainfall currently being flagged up here. But to the lee of high ground, you know, it could be quite dry in eastern parts of Scotland, for example, where you've got some shelter. Parts of Scandinavia, wetter than average because we've got that westerly flow. And again, the far southeast away from the high pressure, also wetter than average. For the week after that, heading into late November, still higher than normal pressure being flagged up across southern parts of the UK. Notice a stronger signal for lower than normal pressure across the east and somewhat of a northwesterly flow then between those two features. Still though, very mild across parts of Scandinavia for the time of the year. It's still pretty chilly down across the southeast, and for the UK, no great strong signal either way, because the days won't be too bad where you get the sunshine, but you can still get some pretty chilly nights. Remember, when high pressure builds in, frost and fog becomes more of a feature, and as we head later on in the season with the sun getting weaker, the fog gets harder to shift depending on where that high sets up. And also drier than normal conditions showing up in Western Europe for this time frame at this stage, and that extends into some southern other parts of Europe as well. Then as we go into early December, late November, early December, still that signal for higher than normal pressure across southern parts of Europe. It is weakening across the UK, but a weak signal at the moment. So I'm not promising high pressure will last for 3 weeks, but what it does suggest is what normally happens at this time of year when it's often wet and windy with some fairly stormy conditions, that doesn't look particularly likely, at least not frequently over the next few weeks. It's likely to be less stormy than normal, and therefore some longer dry spells than you would probably normally expect for the time of the year, but not necessarily completely dry right the way through this sequence. And overall, still slightly above average temperatures showing up across much of Europe, especially across Scandinavia, which was the story for much of last winter, of course. And at the moment, no massively strong signal for the UK. There are pockets of slightly drier than average to the east of high ground, but equally wetter than average to the west of high ground. But actually much of Europe here coming up with some shading of brown, indicating drier than normal conditions for the time of the year. So just to summarise that for the UK, it is looking pretty changeable at first this week and into the weekend, with some rain and showers at times. But as I say, there will be some drier interludes, such as on Thursday, where you get that transient ridge between each area of low pressure. But towards mid-month onwards, it does look like it becomes more settled, especially in the south, and that will bring an increased risk of frost and fog for the latter third of November in particular. And then possibility of some rain at times, more especially in the north. But as I say, depending on where that high sets up, we could see some of that weakening rain coming further south. But if we do get rain in the south, in general, it looks like it will be fairly light and patchy or weaker, not expecting the big deluges that we saw through the beginning of October at least, where we saw 100 millimetres or whatever in a few days. So it is relatively settled over the next few weeks. Yes, there will be a little bit of rain at times, but on balance, some reasonable dry weather to be had as well. And you can keep up to date with the latest day-by-day forecast as ever by following us on social media.